Why did the chef who created their famous recipes finally burn the kitchen down? The fire marshal asked me why I was smiling while my life's work went up in flames. I told him it wasn't my life's work burning. It was theirs. They just didn't know it yet, because they'd been serving my recipes under someone else's name for 7 years. And tonight, standing in the parking lot of Bellingham's most beloved restaurant, while smoke poured from the kitchen windows, I finally felt something close to peace. The investigators would later determine the fire started from a grease buildup in the ventilation system, years of neglected maintenance creating the perfect conditions for disaster. But I knew the truth. That kitchen didn't burn because of grease. It burned because Victor Ashworth had stolen everything from me, my recipes, my reputation, my future, and the universe had finally decided to collect the debt. The firefighters were still hosing down the building when Detective Laura Reeves approached me with a notepad. She had tired eyes and a coffee stain on her sleeve, and she asked me to explain why I was there at 11:47 on a Wednesday night. I told her I'd come to say goodbye. She didn't believe me. Neither would you, probably. But by the time I finished telling you what happened, you'll understand why I stood there watching those flames and felt nothing but relief. I'd been cooking professionally for 15 years when I answered an ad in the local paper looking for a sous chef at a new upscale restaurant called Ashworth's. This was back in 2016, before the place became an institution, before the James Beard nominations and the glowing reviews in national publications. Back then, it was just a half-renovated building on Lakewood Drive, with an owner who had more ambition than talent. Victor Ashworth was 43 years old, silver hair that he styled to look distinguished, and the kind of handshake that squeezed too hard like he was trying to prove something. He'd inherited money from his father's real estate business and decided he wanted to be a restaurateur because he thought it looked glamorous. What he didn't have was any actual ability in the kitchen. His culinary training consisted of a 3-week course at some resort in Tuscany and a collection of cookbooks he displayed but never opened. I should have recognized the warning signs in that first interview. He spent 45 minutes talking about his vision and maybe 3 minutes asking about my experience. He wanted someone who could execute his concepts, he said, someone who could translate his ideas into dishes. What he really wanted, I'd later understand, was someone to do all the work while he took all the credit. The first 6 months were exhausting, but exciting. I was 31, hungry to prove myself, and Victor gave me almost complete freedom in the kitchen. Develop a menu, he'd say, waving his hand dismissively. Something sophisticated but approachable. I stayed late every night, experimenting with flavors, refining techniques, creating dishes that felt like they belonged to something special. The seared duck breast with cherry gas streak that would later become their signature entree took me 3 weeks to perfect. The butternut squash bisque that food critics called transcendent was my grandmother's recipe, elevated with brown butter and sage. The chocolate lava cake that people drove 40 miles to eat was something I'd been working on since culinary school, the ratio of flour to chocolate calibrated through hundreds of failed attempts. I poured everything I had into that menu. Every dish was mine, every flavor profile, every plating concept, every technique. Victor's contribution was tasting things and saying yes or no, occasionally suggesting we add more butter because he'd read somewhere that butter makes everything better. When the restaurant opened to rave reviews, I expected some acknowledgement. A mention in interviews, maybe. A nod toward the team. Instead, Victor stood in front of cameras and talked about his culinary philosophy, his creative process, his journey as a chef. The first article that made my stomach drop was in the Bellingham Herald, a feature on Victor Ashworth and his innovative approach to Pacific Northwest cuisine. The reporter asked about the duck dish, and Victor described the inspiration like he'd personally received it in a dream. I developed that recipe over months of experimentation, he said. The cherry gas streak was particularly challenging because the acidity had to balance perfectly with the richness of the duck fat. I read those words in the break room, my hands shaking, telling myself it was just marketing. Restaurants need a face, a story. Victor was the owner. Of course, he'd be the one doing interviews. But then I found the cookbook proposal. It was sitting on his desk during a late night when I'd gone to his office looking for the updated vendor contacts. A 60-page document titled The Ashworth Kitchen, Recipes from the Heart, complete with his photo on the mock cover and detailed descriptions of every dish I'd created as if he'd invented them himself. The advance from the publisher was listed at $175,000. My name appeared nowhere in the document. Not in the acknowledgments, not in the recipe credits, not anywhere. I took photos of every page with my phone, my pulse pounding, not knowing yet how important those images would become. Then I put the proposal back exactly where I'd found it and went home to stare at the ceiling until sunrise. I tried to address it professionally. The next morning, I knocked on Victor's office door and asked if we could discuss recipe attribution. He looked at me with genuine confusion, like I'd asked him to explain quantum physics. Attribution? The dishes you develop under my employ belong to the restaurant, Elliot. That's standard in this industry. You signed a contract. I had signed a contract. A 23-page document I'd barely skimmed because I was desperate for work and trusted that a professional establishment would treat employees fairly. Victor pulled it from his filing cabinet and showed me the clause. All intellectual property developed during employment becomes the exclusive property of Ashworth Enterprises, LLC. I argued that intellectual property typically referred to things like branded materials and proprietary systems, not creative recipes developed using my own techniques and family traditions. He smiled in that patronizing way he had and told me I was welcome to consult a lawyer if I was confused about the terms I'd agreed to. I left his office feeling like I'd been punched. That night, I called my mother and asked her how she felt about her butternut squash soup recipe being published in a cookbook under someone else's name. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I'll never forget. Some people build things, Elliot, and some people steal what others build and call it their own. The question is whether you're going to let him. The cookbook came out in spring of 2018 and became a regional bestseller. Victor did signings at bookstores, gave cooking demonstrations on the local morning show, and accepted an award from the Chamber of Commerce for culinary excellence. My recipes, my techniques, my grandmother's soup, all of it presented as the creative genius of a man who couldn't properly dice an onion without supervision. I kept my head down and kept working, telling myself I was building experience, building a reputation, that eventually I'd leave and open my own place where I'd get the credit I deserved. But Victor had other plans. He started taking more active involvement in the kitchen, showing up during service to bark orders he didn't understand, making changes to dishes that ruined the flavor profiles I'd carefully constructed. He insisted on adding truffle oil to the risotto because truffle oil was trendy, ignoring my explanation that the quality we could afford at our price point would taste like chemicals. The dish that had earned us consistent praise became something guests complained about. When the reviews started mentioning inconsistency, Victor blamed the kitchen staff. Then came the expansion. Victor announced he was opening a second location across town, and he wanted me to help train the new kitchen team. What he actually wanted, I realized, was for me to document every single recipe in exhaustive detail so he could replicate the menu without needing my involvement. I'd become too expensive, too opinionated, too much of a reminder that the creative vision he sold to the world wasn't actually his. The documentation request came through official channels. A memo from his new operations manager, a woman named Patricia Holbrook, who had an MBA and zero restaurant experience, requesting standardized recipe cards for the entire menu with precise measurements, cooking times, and plating instructions. I knew what this was. They were building a system that would make me redundant. The recipes would exist independently of my knowledge, able to be executed by anyone who could follow instructions. I'd watched it happen at other restaurants, seen talented chefs pushed out once their creativity had been extracted and commodified. So I did something that would later save my case. I started keeping detailed records of everything. Every recipe I'd developed, I documented in my own private notebook with dates, development notes, and the original inspirations. I photographed my handwritten drafts, my experimentation logs, my sketches of plating concepts. I saved emails where I'd proposed new dishes to Victor and received approval, creating a paper trail that showed the ideas originated with me. I recorded conversations on my phone, legal in my state with single-party consent, capturing dozens of instances where Victor discussed my recipes as if they were collaborative efforts or gave vague instructions that I then had to translate into actual dishes. I built an archive of evidence without fully understanding what I was preparing for. I just knew that something was wrong, that I was being systematically erased from my own work, and that someday I might need to prove what had really happened. By 2020, I had 3 years of documentation. 3 years of emails, recordings, photographs, and dated notebooks. 3 years of watching Victor accept praise for my creativity while paying me $52,000 a year and reminding me constantly how lucky I was to work for such a prestigious establishment. The pandemic changed everything. When the restaurant closed for indoor dining, Victor pivoted to a meal kit delivery service, selling packages of pre-portioned ingredients with recipe cards so customers could recreate Ashworth's famous dishes at home. My dishes, sent to thousands of homes across the region, each card featuring Victor's face and his signature at the bottom. The meal kits were enormously successful. Victor did interviews about his entrepreneurial spirit, his ability to adapt, his commitment to bringing restaurant-quality experiences to families stuck at home. The business made more money during the shutdown than it had during normal operations. Kitchen staff were furloughed, then laid off. I was kept on a skeleton crew, working 60-hour weeks to fulfill orders while Victor worked from home and did Zoom interviews with food bloggers. When I asked about hazard pay or overtime compensation, Patricia Holbrook reminded me that I was salaried and exempt. When I pointed out that my salary was based on a 40-hour work week and I was now working 50% more, she said I was welcome to find employment elsewhere if I was unhappy with the arrangement. I couldn't afford to quit. I had rent, student loans from culinary school, and a job market that had completely collapsed. So I kept working, kept documenting, kept building my case while Victor built his empire on my stolen labor. The breaking point came in November of 2020. Victor announced that he was licensing the Ashworth brand to a national food company for a line of frozen meals based on our most popular dishes. The deal was worth $2.3 million. I found out about it from a press release, not from any internal communication. When I confronted Victor, asking whether any of that money would be shared with the staff who had actually developed the products being licensed, he laughed. He actually laughed. "Elliot," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you're a cook. A good cook, I'll grant you that. But cooks are replaceable. Vision isn't. I'm the one who built this brand, who took the risks, who put my name on the line. You just executed my concepts, and according to your contract, that's exactly what you were paid to do." I walked out of his office and drove straight to the law office of Christina Adler, an attorney who specialized in intellectual property disputes. I'd found her through an online forum for restaurant workers discussing labor issues. She had a reputation for taking on cases against established businesses and actually winning. When I sat down in her conference room and started explaining my situation, she held up a hand after about 3 minutes. "Before you go further," she said, "do you have documentation?" I pulled out my laptop and showed her the archive. 3 years of evidence. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through the files. Christina spent 2 weeks reviewing my case before giving me her assessment. The situation was complicated. The contract I'd signed did include broad intellectual property language, but there were potential arguments about whether recipe development fell within the scope of my job description as sous chef. More importantly, there were questions about whether Victor's public claims constituted fraud, specifically whether his interviews and the cookbook represented knowing misrepresentation of the origin of the recipes for personal profit. She brought in a colleague named David Okonkwo, a specialist in food industry litigation who had successfully argued a similar case in California. David's analysis was more optimistic. Recipe theft is notoriously difficult to prove, he explained, because recipes themselves aren't copyrightable. But the creative expression of recipes, the specific language, the development process, the documented evidence of origin, all of that can establish a pattern of misappropriation. If we can prove that Victor knowingly took credit for work he didn't do, we have a fraud case. The timeline was daunting. Building a solid case would take at least a year. Legal fees would accumulate into the tens of thousands. There was no guarantee of success, and even if we won, the recovery might not cover the costs. But David said something that made my decision easy. "Sometimes it's not about the money, Mr. Graves. Sometimes it's about making sure the truth is part of the public record." I continued working at Ashworth's while Christina and David built the case. It was surreal, showing up every day to a kitchen I now understood was a crime scene, cooking dishes I knew I might soon be fighting over in court. I kept documenting, kept recording, kept building evidence, and I started reaching out to former employees, other cooks and kitchen staff who had worked at Ashworth's over the years. What I found was disturbing. I wasn't the only one Victor had stolen from. There was Kimiko Yoshida, a pastry chef who had developed Ashworth's entire dessert menu in 2017, before being fired over a fabricated complaint about attitude. There was Darius Franklin, who had created the brunch menu during a brief expansion into breakfast service, then been pushed out when Victor decided brunch wasn't profitable enough. There was Mei Lin Cho, who had designed the bar program including signature cocktails that were still being served, and who had left after Victor refused to give her a raise despite tripling the bar revenue. Each of them had similar stories. Each of them had watched Victor take credit for their work, and each of them was willing to provide sworn statements about what they had experienced. Christina called it a pattern of behavior. David called it a conspiracy to commit fraud. I called it the beginning of the end. The lawsuit was filed in March of 2021. Elliot Graves versus Ashworth Enterprises, LLC, and Victor Ashworth, individually. The complaint alleged fraud, misappropriation of intellectual property, and unjust enrichment, seeking damages and equitable relief, including public acknowledgement of the true origins of the recipes in question. Victor's response was immediate and vicious. He hired a team from Campbell and Associates, a firm known for aggressive defense tactics, led by an attorney named Richard Blackwell, who had a reputation for destroying plaintiffs in depositions. Within a week, I received a countersuit for breach of confidentiality, claiming that by discussing the recipes publicly, I had violated my employment agreement. I also received a termination letter. After 7 years, I was fired for cause, the cause being bringing unauthorized legal action against my employer. Christina had anticipated this. We filed for wrongful termination, adding to the complaint. We also submitted a motion to consolidate the cases, arguing that the countersuit was retaliatory and designed to silence legitimate grievances. The judge, an intellectual property specialist named Honorable Patricia Yamamoto, with 18 years on the bench, agreed to hear all matters together. The battle lines were drawn. Discovery was brutal. Victor's legal team demanded every document I possessed, every recording, every photograph. They subpoenaed my phone records, my email accounts, my social media history. They hired a private investigator who followed me for weeks, photographing me going to the grocery store, the gym, a therapist I'd started seeing for anxiety. They were looking for anything they could use to discredit me, any inconsistency in my story, any hint of instability or dishonesty. But I had nothing to hide. Everything I'd documented was true. Every recording was legal. Every claim was supported by evidence. David told me that their aggressive tactics were actually a good sign. "They're scared," he said. "If they had a solid defense, they wouldn't be trying so hard to find dirt on you. They'd just disprove your claims with facts." The depositions lasted 4 days. Victor's attorneys grilled me for hours, asking about every recipe, every conversation, every decision I'd made over 7 years. They tried to catch me in contradictions, to confuse me with timeline questions, to suggest that my memory was unreliable. But I had my notebooks. I had my recordings. I had dates and details and documentation that showed exactly what had happened and when. When it was Victor's turn to be deposed, the mask started to slip. Christina led the deposition, and watching her work was like watching a surgeon operate. She began with simple questions about Victor's culinary training, his experience developing recipes, his creative process. Victor answered confidently at first, describing his Tuscan cooking course and his self-taught expertise. Then Christina pulled out the cookbook and asked him to walk through the development of specific dishes. "The duck with cherry gastrique," she said. "Can you explain how you developed this recipe?" Victor launched into the story he'd told in interviews about experimentation and inspiration and finding the perfect balance of flavors. Then Christina pulled out my notebook, dated 18 months before the cookbook was published, containing my detailed notes on developing the exact same dish. She read aloud from my entries, the specific techniques I'd tried, the failures I'd documented, the moment I'd finally achieved the right gastrique consistency. She showed Victor the photos of my handwritten development notes, time-stamped months before he claimed to have created the recipe. "Can you explain," she asked calmly, "how your independent development of this dish perfectly mirrors the documented development process of my client?" Victor's attorney objected. Victor stumbled. His confident demeanor cracked, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. The deposition continued for 2 more days, and each day brought more revelations. Victor couldn't explain how his creative process produced recipes that exactly matched my documented development notes. He couldn't account for email threads where I proposed dishes that he later claimed as his own concepts. He couldn't explain why the butternut squash soup in his cookbook used my grandmother's exact technique, a technique that wasn't published anywhere, and that I had learned from watching her cook as a child. His attorneys tried to argue that parallel development was common in the culinary world, that similar ideas could emerge independently, but the specificity of the evidence was overwhelming. When Christina showed him a recording of a conversation where he explicitly said, "I have no idea how to make that sauce," Elliot figures all that stuff out, his face went pale. The recording continued with Victor telling a potential investor that the technical side was handled by his team, but the creative vision was all him. It was the clearest possible evidence that he knew the recipes weren't his, and was actively deceiving people about their origin. The case went to trial in September of 2022. By then, the story had attracted media attention. A local food blogger named Janelle Winters had written a detailed exposé about recipe theft in the restaurant industry, using our case as a central example. The article went viral in culinary circles, and suddenly everyone had an opinion about intellectual property and creative credit in professional kitchens. Former colleagues reached out with messages of support. Other chefs who had experienced similar exploitation started sharing their own stories online. The trial became about more than just my case. It became a referendum on how the industry treated creative workers. The courtroom was packed every day. Food journalists, culinary students, restaurant workers who had taken days off to witness the proceedings. Victor arrived each morning in expensive suits, trying to project confidence, but the testimony from witnesses steadily dismantled his narrative. Kimiko Yoshida described developing the dessert menu and watching Victor take credit in interviews. Darius Franklin explained how his brunch concepts became Ashworth's brunch concepts the moment he walked out the door. Mei-Lin Cho detailed the cocktail recipes she'd created and the zero acknowledgement she'd received. When I finally took the stand, I spent 3 days walking through every piece of evidence: the notebooks, the recordings, the emails, the photographs, the timeline that showed conclusively that I had created the recipes that Victor claimed as his own. Victor's defense strategy was to paint me as a disgruntled employee who had contributed some ideas but vastly exaggerated my role. Richard Blackwell argued that recipe development was a collaborative process, that Victor provided guidance and direction that I merely executed. He suggested that my documentation was created after the fact, designed to manufacture a case for financial gain. But his arguments fell apart under scrutiny. The metadata on my photographs proved they were taken years before the lawsuit. The email timestamps were verified by server logs. The recordings were authenticated by a digital forensics expert named Dr. Rebecca Townsend, who testified that they showed no signs of manipulation or editing. The final blow came from an unexpected source. Patricia Holbrook, Victor's own operations manager, was called as a witness by our side. She had left Ashworth's 6 months earlier under unclear circumstances. On the stand, she admitted that Victor had instructed her to pressure me for recipe documentation, specifically because he was planning to open additional locations without me. She admitted that internal discussions referred to me as the actual creator of the menu, and she admitted that Victor had once told her, in a moment of frustration, that he couldn't let Elliot know how important he was, or he'd start demanding what he deserved. The jury deliberated for less than a day. They found Victor Ashworth and Ashworth Enterprises liable on all counts: fraud, misappropriation, unjust enrichment, wrongful termination. The damages awarded totaled $1.8 million, including profits from the cookbook, a portion of the licensing deal, and punitive damages for willful misconduct. Judge Yamamoto added an injunction requiring all future publications and products to accurately credit the true developers of the recipes. She also referred the matter to the state bar for investigation into whether Victor's attorneys had knowingly participated in the concealment of evidence. Victor's face was gray as the verdict was read. His empire, built on stolen creativity, had finally crumbled. The Bellingham Herald ran the story on the front page. Food publications across the country covered the verdict as a landmark case for creative workers' rights. Victor's second restaurant location, which had been struggling anyway, closed within 3 months. The cookbook was pulled from distribution pending revision. The licensing deal collapsed when the food company decided they didn't want to be associated with the controversy. The fire happened 3 weeks after the verdict. I was at home, working on plans for my own restaurant, when I saw the news alert on my phone. Ashworth's restaurant on Lakewood Drive was engulfed in flames. By the time I drove out there, the building was a shell, smoke still rising from the ruined kitchen that had been my workplace for 7 years. Detective Laura Reeves found me in the crowd and asked why I'd come. I told her the truth. This place was my life for 7 years. I needed to see it end. She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. The arson investigation would eventually determine that the fire started from accumulated grease in a ventilation system that hadn't been properly maintained in years. Victor had been cutting corners on maintenance since the lawsuit began, trying to reduce costs as his legal bills mounted. The fire was ruled accidental, a consequence of negligence rather than malice. No charges were filed. Insurance covered the building, but not the reputation. Victor Ashworth, once the toast of Bellingham's culinary scene, became a cautionary tale told in hospitality programs about the dangers of building a brand on someone else's talent. I'm writing this 18 months after the verdict. My restaurant, Graves Kitchen, opened 6 months ago in a renovated space downtown. The menu features my recipes, properly credited, along with new creations I've developed since leaving Ashworth's. The butternut squash soup is dedicated to my grandmother's memory. The duck with cherry gastrique is listed as the dish that started a revolution. Food critics have been kind. The reviews mention my history, the lawsuit, the fire. They call my cooking thoughtful and technically brilliant. They use words like authentic and honest. For the first time in my career, people know who actually created the food they're eating. Victor tried to rebuild. He opened a smaller place in a suburb, trading on whatever remained of his reputation. It closed within 4 months. Last I heard, he was consulting for a meal kit company, advising them on brand development without actually being involved in recipe creation. The irony isn't lost on me. The recordings and notebooks that saved my case are stored in a safety deposit box now. I hope I never need them again, but I learned my lesson about documentation. Everything I create, everything I develop, gets dated and archived. Not because I'm paranoid, but because I know how quickly someone can take credit for work that isn't theirs. Standing in that parking lot watching Ashworth's burn, I wasn't thinking about revenge or justice or vindication. I was thinking about my grandmother's kitchen, about learning to cook by her side, about the first time I made her soup, and she said it was even better than hers. I was thinking about all the dishes I'd created in that building, all the late nights and early mornings, all the creativity I'd poured into food that other people consumed without knowing whose hands had actually made it. The fire didn't destroy my work. My work lived on in the notebooks, in the recipes, in the muscle memory of techniques I'd practiced 10,000 times. What burned that night was Victor's theft, his deception, his castle built on borrowed genius. I didn't set that fire. I didn't need to. Victor Ashworth destroyed himself the moment he decided that taking credit was easier than doing the work. He thought he could erase me, replace me, pretend I was just another cook executing his vision. But here's what people like Victor never understand about creators. We don't just make things. We remember how we made them. We carry the process in our minds, the failures and discoveries, the evolution of ideas. You can steal a recipe, but you can't steal the knowledge of how it was born. That knowledge was always mine. It still is. And now, finally, everyone knows it. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.